Is Patriot Front a legit white nationalist group at the root of 80% of all white supremacist content in the US, or is it an FBI operation meant to trap unsuspecting individuals and terrorize a nation into thinking domestic terrorism is our number one problem? So maybe you saw this over the weekend. About 150 men from the group Patriot Front marched through Washington, D.C., wearing khaki pants, blue shirts, and white face masks, carrying upside down American flags, shields, and battle drums. The group is a white nationalist group, and some of their statements on their website says things like, when our Colombian forefathers left their European homes, they found a common cause and a common identity as Americans. From varied nations and cultures of Europe, a new nation was forged in the flames of conquest. To be an American is to be a descendant of conquerors, pioneers, visionaries, and explorers. This unique identity was given to us by our ancestors, and this national spirit remains firmly rooted in our blood. They go on to say our mission is a hard reset on the nation we see today, a return to the traditions and virtues of our forefathers. America needs a generation of brave men to fearlessly rise to face all threats to their collective interests, a generation steeled in their effort to realize their grand vision of a new nation. This gathering of the faithful and true inheritors of America will urge our people onward. So far, it's just like a bunch of, they just like say a bunch of stuff that doesn't really mean much. But ultimately, they say that those of foreign birth may occupy civil status within the lands occupied by the state, and they may even be dutiful citizens, yet they may not be American. Membership within the American nation is inherited through blood, not ink. Even those born in America may yet be foreign. Nationhood cannot be bestowed upon those who are not of founding stock of our people and those who do not share the common spirit that permeates our greater civilization and the European diaspora. So that is what Patriot Front kind of says about themselves. So decidedly, you've got to be a European descendant, a conqueror, a pioneer of some kind, and that makes you true American. Everybody else is just kind of here as, I don't know, like a green card holder or something. So the group was formed in late 2017 from one of the disaffected members of Vanguard America, which was one of the groups that attended the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And apparently that member was pretty disgusted by Charlottesville and basically hacked and took over Vanguard's website and renamed it Patriot Front. And most of the members in Patriot Front come from this Vanguard group. Patriot Front is based in Texas, and according to the 2021 numbers, the group has about 200 members from across the country, excluding Hawaii and Kansas. For some reason, they were able to exclude those states. So it's actually really impressive that 150 out of the 200 would have shown up in Washington, D.C. this weekend to march in uniform and unison. Since then, they have done these sorts of events where they show up in these uniforms and kind of peacefully march around escorted by large amounts of police. These pop up every so often. So why do people think this is an FBI op? With us now is Ford Fischer. He's an independent journalist and filmmaker. He is the editor-in-chief of News to Share, a company which has White House press credentials. It's a new platform for raw video journalism related to political activism. And Ford Fischer very much goes on the scene, gets that raw video, and talks to a lot of these people. So Ford, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think there's going to be quite a lot to unpack. I think starting just kind of chronologically, I do want to point out or clarify that you mentioned kind of how Patriot Front evolved out of Vanguard America, which was at Charlottesville. Just to be sort of abundantly clear, Thomas Rousseau, who is the founder of Patriot Front and who is the main face, one of the only people that shows up at all of their events or many of their events while not wearing a mask, whereas the rest of them uniformly wear a mask. He was at Charlottesville on August 11th, 2017. And while he was there, I asked, why are you allying? Yes, the interview that you just pulled onto the screen. Basically, why are you allying with National Socialists, Nazis? And the exact words that he actually uses in this clip are, he says, I'm a fascist myself, so I'm not allying with them. I am one. And then he goes on to explain his ideology from there. And so you kind of read this, he uses all of this vocabulary. It looks like he really hit the thesaurus pretty hard before writing the manifesto on the Patriot Front website or whatever. But basically, the the big flowery language that he attaches to this ideology, talking about forefathers and ancestors and all this kind of stuff. What he means is white nationalism. What he means is he
Right.
wants a country for white people. And to the extent that other people wouldn't be allowed in that country, as you pointed out, he thinks that they should be like non-citizens or something. This definitionally, this is white nationalism. And both definitionally and from a literal perspective of self-identification, he is a fascist. A
Okay, when
investigation
you
by
talk to
ProPublica
him,
also showed Mussolini is required reading for his members.
oh, I see. Really, out of the okay. So when you were there in Charlottesville, was he a member of Vanguard Group at that point, or
Yeah,
Vanguard
at the
America?
end
I
of
think is
that
what they were
exact
called.
interview, sorry, yes, at the end of that exact interview, he identified himself as a member of Vanguard America, and it is largely understood that the rebranding was to try to make Patriot Front or make this kind of fascist ideology more palatable or look like something related to conservatism or the Patriot movement as a whole, and also to distance themselves from James Alex Fields, who, of course, committed the car attack for which he was convicted of murder following Charlottesville, and he was holding a shield that bared the Vanguard America logo. So
Right.
essentially, they tried to distance themselves from that past.
And rebrand, but it's basically the same group ultimately. I mean, most of the same members, and there's only 200 of them. So let's go over the reasons why people think that this is an FBI op. I mean, one of the obvious being they're kind of wearing FBI outfits, right? With the khaki pants and the blue shirt, looks a lot like FBI uniforms. They're all fit, nobody's overweight. There's I mean 200 to show up, or 150 to show up when the membership's only about 200. Like, what kind of money do these people have that they'd be able to just pop up at an event, all looking exactly the same, wearing the exact same, pretty much, a very uniform, which you don't see much when it comes to groups like this. um, they're very organized. What are some of the other reasons that people cite from your experience that these guys might be
Yeah,
more of a fed up than anything?
so I do think that there's a certain convenience to for some people to refer to them as a fed up, right? So there is an inconvenience to a group calling themselves patriots that is espousing explicitly white nationalist fascist ideology. And so there is a certain type of conservative who would identify as a patriot who would sort of have reason to say, I believe they're fake. And to be clear, I'm not necessarily making the argument that there's not feds among them. In fact, I think there probably are. But I think that that's actually a really primary driving force for them to look for reasons to believe that the group essentially doesn't exist. As pointed out, I before the group existed, I interviewed the person who would go on to found it, and he's already identifying as a fascist. And it is indisputable that, as you saw in the clip that you just posted, that guy is still leading it. 6 years later. And so there is no really disputing that the group is real, or at least that the group is led by by a real person who has been arrested multiple times in the service of that cause. And that's who I'm talking about with the cowboy hat in that in that clip that you're showing right now. As it relates to the size and the uniforms and so forth, just to break down a couple of the elements that make them unique. So it is true that among right wing groups, there is not usually a whole lot of operational security. So, like, the anti-fascist movement, for example, they dress in black bloc in some cases. They don't bring their cell phones to things. They engage in operational security because they have a skepticism of the state. They believe that the police are against them and so forth. Whereas conservatives are not really fighting the police nearly to the same extent until January 6th, right? So January 6th was a situation where a lot of people filmed themselves doing things that they would later be prosecuted for. And so there was a huge evidentiary gap, a huge difference between how easy it was to prosecute right wingers versus how easy it was to prosecute like the Antifa movement in Portland. Patriot Front is basically one of the only right wing groups that actually follows those same kind of OPSEC procedures, such as having them all dressed uniformly. The other thing is that Thomas Rousseau sells them gear. So they're all wearing these like jackets, masks, patches, buttons, all this stuff. The leader of it is making money from them, right? They get their
Hmm.
membership and then they are paying him for this stuff. And then the khakis don't match. There was actually someone who was making fun of them at the march that happened 2 days ago by pointing out that their pants don't match. They all get them at Walmart, Target, whatever. They all end up looking not exactly the same because that's not provided by the person on the top who is making money from it. But ultimately, for that one leader of it, this is a business, and so yeah, to some extent, he is successful in exploiting his members for money. As far as numbers, so Washington D.C. has been the site of approximately 150 person to 200 person formations on now about four occasions. So there was two, one in 2020 and I think one in 2021, and then there was the March for Life where they marched parallel to a anti-abortion march, and then there was this one that happened 2 days ago. So about once a year. Um, the very first one, they had actually an anti-fascist infiltrator, which is how I became aware that it was going to be happening. And I actually interviewed that person before the Patriot Front people showed up. Um, and my understanding from that person is that somewhere in Virginia they have some kind of a campsite or something like that that they've been able to assemble at. And this is further kind of verifiable because on their website they have videos, including of them training in the woods and so forth. And so they make some kind of a little camp out of it, invite all their people to one spot, and that seems to happen in large numbers near DC. When they've gone to other places, such as Idaho, where they were arrested, such as Ohio twice, it's usually more like a dozen of them. In Texas, I once was at an event, a protest against a drag show, where two of them showed up.
Hmm.
And so they have the ability to assemble en masse near DC, presumably because they have a large space and a lot of time probably to prep in sort of the background for each of those things. But I don't think that that's somehow like proof that they walked out of the Pentagon or Quantico and put
Well,
on
it's
the
certainly
infrastructure
eyebrow
to go
raising.
for
I
it.
mean, look, like if they can only get 2 or 12 at any other event, but in DC they're able to assemble 150 of them, when this is a Texas-based organization with members all around the country, that is very suspicious, Ford. I'm not going to lie. But I mean, I would say I think that the majority of the people that showed up to this one, if I had to guess, I would think that most of them are feds for that reason. How easy it is it if you're the FBI and you're trying to infiltrate one of these groups? How easy is it then that the leader sells the gear? So then you can just order the gear, make sure you show up in the right gear with your face all covered up, and get in the group and act like you're one of them. And how would they have the ability to have money to put a site in, where did you say, North Carolina, when this is a Texas based organization? And Thomas
My
Rousseau
understanding is that's
started
in
this.
Virginia.
Oh, in Virginia. Thomas Rousseau started this as a teenager. So unless he's somehow a trust funder and he's funding all of this, I mean, he's not an old guy. He's a young guy. He's a young guy that, would
Well,
be
again, his members are
presumably at the
funding it.
beginning of his, well, his member,
He's
right. But
selling
again,
stuff to his members who are basically all
sure.
college age kids. So to
Again,
some
how do they
extent, I
have the
would think there's a
money?
lot of trust fund babies that are
Right.
going
But,
to college,
well,
telling their mom, "Oh yeah, I'm going on a weekend trip," and then they go hang out with the Nazis for the weekend.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, I don't know how many college kids just have the money to like up and go to a rally in DC. And then another thing that's very suspicious is they didn't show up to January 6th. They were noticeably absent from that. Suddenly they show
They're
up
not
a
Trump
month later.
supporters. They're not Trump
Why
supporters.
wouldn't
They
they
and they've
be? Why
rallied.
wouldn't they be?
They don't believe in America, for one thing. I mean, so that their entire ideology is that they want the establishment of a new state in which non-white people are not able to be citizens. They are white nationalists. And to be clear, like there are some examples that people have been able to find of people who espoused white nationalist ideology who ended up at January 6th. But for the most part, that was not the driving
Right.
factor, right? Like there were nationalists, there were far right people, but white nationalism was an animating force at Charlottesville, and indeed the sort of preambles to Patriot Front showed up at Charlottesville. But January 6th would be sort of a separate ideology. I think that the other thing that I would really point out is that the Patriot Front people, as opposed to other people in kind of extreme political activism, are not interested in actually getting into fights. So
Hmm.
they don't carry guns. They don't carry really weapons. They carry these shields, but I've never really heard of them actually brawling with them. And they also don't announce their presence before they go to things. So they're showing up in some cases to other people's events. So sometimes like in Ohio and Texas, they've shown up at a drag event that's already being protested. They show up, do their own protests and then leave. And then in DC, they've shown up to, and also Chicago, they've shown up at pro-life events, kind of like hijacked them and then left. And then in DC also they've done these formations where they just march kind of in a flash mob and
Yeah.
again leave. But they don't show up to places hoping to confront people. They don't want people to know that they're going to be somewhere before they do it. And they really rely on the police to protect them. So like someone like the Proud Boys, they get into fights with these other groups, and I think to some extent that can be their intention. With Patriot Front, that doesn't seem to be what they're interested in, and so it would make sense to me that even if they were ideologically driven by the same things that contributed to January 6th, which I would contend that they are not. But even if they did, I think that their obsession with getting in and out of stuff without getting into trouble would have prevented them from being at January 6th. In the case of Idaho, the one
Well,
time
but
they were
nobody
arrested,
knew January 6th was going to turn into January 6th. So,
I think
you
it
would
was
just
it was
show.
obvious to me that it would turn into something, quite frankly. I didn't necessarily know that they were going to like storm the Capitol,
Right.
but the preceding 2 million MAGA marches both led to violence in the evenings following them. And so while I didn't know exactly how January 6th would go, I mean, people were talking about it in terms of like, this is going to be the revolution. We might occupy buildings, this sort of thing. I think it was clear that something would happen on January 6th. And if a group is like pathologically incapable of going to something where they might get into a fight, then January 6th wouldn't be for them.
So just so everybody's watching, Ford and I agree that there's probably FBI in Patriot Front. There's like, I
Absolutely.
mean, the
I
FBI has been
totally think they
infiltrating every
are.
single group, right?
Yes.
But where we
Absolutely
disagree is
infiltrating.
that the amount of FBI in Patriot Front. I tend to look at this group and think, I think the majority that showed up to this past weekend, 150, I would say that's pretty much a Fed op. And you think that there's just some Fed there, but it's not actually a Fed op.
Yeah, so just to give kind of an example of one situation that happened that probably gives us the most information. In Idaho, there was a event where there was a drag and other LGBT kind of pride event that was being protested already by various other right wing groups. There was a right wing motorcycle gang, the Patriot Riders Club, I think it was called, something like that was protesting it, and Patriot Front sort of showed up at, or was going to show up at it unannounced. And what happened in that situation was that the sheriff's department there pulled over the U-Haul. So they had a moving truck with all their people in the back of it, which is a tactic that they've used on several occasions. And they were taken out of the U-Haul basically like at gunpoint, and surrounded by police, each individually zip tied. And then once they were zip tied, they were then sort of unmasked and arrested one by one. Most of this I've actually seen from video because I was at the protest itself that they were on their way to, which was about a mile away. And so by the time I got to them, there was actually only a couple of them left who were still being processed. So I caught kind of the tail end of that on video. The reason that I'm bringing this up is that a total of 31 of them were arrested and identified. And first of all, none of them charged have offered as a defense, that they are feds, right? Oh, well,
Mhm.
not me because I'm an undercover. And to be clear, absolutely it is true that undercovers can eat some criminal charges in order to get deeper undercover. So I'm not saying that that didn't occur. Um, that afternoon, the police held a press conference, which I attended, and they described that the reason that they pulled over the U-Haul was that they had gotten a 911 call from a concerned citizen saying that it was weird that people were getting into a U-Haul, and that's how they tracked down this U-Haul, pulled them over, and whatever. That 911 call has never been released, and when they were doing this press conference, they were talking about all the agencies that were involved: Idaho State Police, Sheriff's Department, and our federal partners, they pointed out. And I actually asked the police chief, what did you mean by that? He said, yeah, we were in contact with the FBI all day. So I don't know. I would say that this is sort of speculative to some extent, but I do think that it is at least likely, or beyond the preponderance of the evidence in my mind, that it would only take one federal informant inside of that U-Haul to say, "Hey, we all got into a U-Haul. If you arrest all of us now, you'll be able to basically ID everybody." Um, we'll find out, maybe, if that's how that happened. But I think that it is beyond likely that with the feds monitoring that situation, and then that being the one time that Patriot Front was actually arrested, I think that it's fairly likely that they were, at least to some degree, infiltrated. Just
Yeah.
as a side sort of example, in December, two Boogaloo members were arrested with part of the evidence that led to their arrests. One was for illegally owning firearms while being a user of drugs. Another was for making threats against feds, and then that same charge about illegally owning firearms. Um, in one of the indictments in the criminal complaint, it cited 6 confidential human sources in one single signal chat. So Patriot Front, obviously different than the Boogaloos. Those two groups hate each other for what it's worth. But I think that it sort of shows that the feds heavily infiltrate groups like this. But
Yeah.
again, that doesn't mean that the groups themselves are flatly artificial, that they're completely fake.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose if the Fed is going to at least grow it to 200 members, it's still a very tiny group. And the one thing that's really amazing about Patriot Front is that the ADL actually says that 80% of white nationalist or white supremacist content comes from Patriot Front, a group that's 200 members strong. That's it. 200 people in the United States are causing 80% of the white supremacist hate speech online. That to me is that just goes in line with what the Biden administration has been trying to push since they got into office, which is that domestic terrorism is our number one threat. And so from my viewpoint, they would do everything they can to sort of showcase this, like a domestic terror. For one, with Patriot Front, if since they are essentially a rebranding of Vanguard America, which the guy that killed the woman in Charlottesville was, as you said, had the shield of Vanguard America. So they're trying to rebrand and distance themselves. If you were the FBI, that's the group you would infiltrate. If you're going to infiltrate any group, that was such a hot, temperature issue in this country. That is what really got people going on. White nationalism, white supremacy is a real problem in this country. Trump's fault, right? They were all blaming it. And Charlottesville was the thing that they pointed to. And so if Charlottesville was such a hot button issue, you would think that the FBI, the very first thing they do, it would actually be in a way irresponsible for them to not go and try to infiltrate Patriot Front if Patriot Front was in fact Vanguard, which then led to the event that happened in Charlottesville. So from their point of view, they would say, well, we have to infiltrate this group. We have to see what they're up to and use it as a way to draw people in with this ideology, because they believe that this is the number one issue we're facing. In fact, let's play a couple of clips. We got Joe Biden. Here was this weekend. He was speaking at Howard University saying that domestic terror, that white supremacy is our biggest issue. Let's play that clip.
To stand up against the poison of white supremacy, as I did my inaugural address, to single out as the most dangerous terrorist threat to our homeland is white supremacy. And I'm not saying this because I'm at a black HBCU. I say it wherever I go.
And then we have Department of Homeland Security Mayorkas actually saying he's agreeing. Here's that clip as well.
The president yesterday at his commencement address for the Howard University graduates called white supremacy the major domestic terror threat in this country. Is that correct?
It tragically is. In the terrorism context, domestic violent extremism is our greatest threat right now. Individuals driven to violence because of ideologies of hate, anti-government sentiments, false narratives, personal grievances, and the like. And regrettably, we have seen a rise in white supremacy.
Yeah. So, you take the Biden administration who comes into office with the idea that white supremacy is our biggest issue. We've got to face this. And there's been documents of them, saying we've got to do what we can to educate the public on how to combat this. And we've got to put a lot of FBI resources into this. And we've had FBI whistleblowers come out saying they're really putting a full court press on trying to find these, domestic extremists. So you've got this bias in the government. And then you have the event at Charlottesville, and of course they're going to infiltrate that group. Of course they're going to try to grow it in order to try to bring people into this plot, just like they did with the Wolverine, with the Michigan. What was the name of that group?
You're referring to the Wolverine Watchmen militia.
Yeah, Wolverine Watchmen, right? And there were 17 of them, and 12 of them ended up being FBI agents or informants of some kind. And so, I think obviously many of us, I mean, there's so many reasons to point to the fact that they're not just that the FBI has infiltrated these groups. The FBI gives them ideas. The FBI, it tries to grow them in order to try to draw out these people with this plot of domestic terrorism. And so, when I look at Patriot Front, and these are supposedly young kids, and they have money, they're wearing matching outfits. They are heavily escorted by the police. They're not causing any crime or any ruckus, which is interesting. And also, there have been videos of people, people getting video of them like going down into the subway and being able to leave, when they finish up their march. And the police actually block the entrance of the subway. Other people are not allowed to follow them. So that's also kind of, eyebrow raising. So this group is, yeah, go ahead, Ford.
I'd like, okay, so there was a lot that was sort of shared there. So as a general point, I would say that the fact that the federal government, both the executive branch and, or I should say Biden and then like federal agencies are describing white supremacism as something that they're focusing on, it's surely
Number one.
It follows that it would make sense that they would try to infiltrate those groups and so forth. But them saying that is not evidence that they are manufacturing it. Trump placing a emphasis on Islamic extremism doesn't make Islamic extremism fake, for example.
But a lot of it was. I mean, we now know that the FBI,
and we know that sometimes it has
they did bait a lot of these people into that. I mean, a lot of the domestic terror, a lot of the terrorists that were Islamic terrorists that they got after 9/11, we now know that many of them, they took mentally ill people and they basically put them into a plot. And they just said, they baited them into that. So we know that the FBI, I mean,
that has happened. I would say that it is not evidence that an entire group is somehow manufactured until there's actually something that shows that that's the case, right? So like in the case of the people who were criminally indicted the one time, the Idaho thing, we haven't yet seen any of those defend themselves by saying I was entrapped by a federal informant. But like that kind of thing is how we would learn about that. And it'll be interesting to see sort of how history stands the test of time. But one kind of major contradiction about this exact issue is that in those sorts of entrapping things, like the, hey, let's go kidnap the governor of Michigan, or, hey, have you just, Mr. Muslim man, do you want to do some terrorism? Right? Like these sorts of federal kind of instigations, that doesn't seem to have happened with Patriot Front because they are ridiculously risk averse, as you just pointed out. Every time they go to things, they are trying to rely on the police to protect them. They are trying their sort of darndest not to get into fights. They aren't bringing weapons. And frankly, when they went to Idaho, I don't think they were anticipating being arrested, right? The actual evidence that was used, so they were all charged, each third of those 31 people was charged with a misdemeanor for conspiracy to riot. And the evidence that they were conspiring to riot was basically that they were wearing the matching masks, that they had some smoke bombs, that they had shields. But those things are things that they've brought to all of these other events that they've been able to get in and out of without getting in trouble. The other time Thomas Rousseau and one other member got arrested, it was because they were putting up stickers, right? Not something that people typically expect themselves to be arrested for. And so far, they've been doing this since the beginning of 2020. We're more than 3 years into hundreds of Patriot Front people doing stuff at least once a year. And so far, none of them have been instigated into doing any kind of large crimes. People talk about, for example, January 6th, like, oh, maybe we were instigated by federal agents. All of certainly the Michigan case where there was actually acquittals and mistrials based on that defense framing. Patriot Front has not actually done something like that, which I think would actually be a kind of countervailing point against the idea that the feds are trying to push them into doing something. If Patriot Front were completely manufactured by the feds as opposed to just sort of heavily infiltrated, I think that they would be instigated into doing the types of crimes that would have gotten them arrested for things that are more serious by now. Instead, the moments that they've been arrested have been more like little surprises, and most of the times that they've done these big formations, they've kind of done it in a way that's compatible with the police protecting them.
I guess it depends on the FBI's goal. If the goal is just to showcase that, here there is white supremacy in the country, and they're trying to bait more people into it to see if they can root out certain extremists, maybe ones they've been following for a while, ones they're hoping will show up to these events that they could then get at that time, I suppose. Or maybe they're just waiting for the right moment to bait this group into some sort of some sort of plot or something. But you're probably right. I mean, probably the main leadership of this group is adverse to any sort of crime committing, and so they kind of talk everybody out of it. But there's no way you're going to be able to talk everyone, if it's 200 members strong, really truly talk everybody out of doing something to save the country if they feel this strongly about, save the country if they feel this strongly about it. But I get your point on that for sure. But at the end of the day, we do agree that the feds are probably in this organization to some level. It's just
Absolutely,
depending
to
on
some
the
extent,
level.
I think
Yeah.
we agree on that. Yep.
Unfortunately, and then that's a question, why are our tax dollars? Of course, we want, law enforcement to go and try to root out and find plots that are going to be harmful to society and harmful to people. Of course, we want that. We want them to be investigating that. But for them to be spending their money on plotting and planning so many of these events that we're seeing in the news, it does raise a lot of questions as to what is the actual goal of the FBI. What are they doing? Especially now we've got the Durham report that came out today. It's just like, what is the FBI up to, and what's our money actually being spent on when there's actual crimes out there being committed that they could maybe be going and investigating? I think is a
Right.
big question that a lot of
So,
Americans
so
have right now.
they would say that the objective of infiltrating is for them to root out a plot that would have happened and therefore
Yeah.
prevent it from happening. Like their narrative of the Whitmer kidnapping, for example, was that would have happened if they were not there, and they prevented it from happening and were able to make the arrests and so forth. So
Yeah.
I think we
But
both
the rest
assume
of us
that
say, no,
that
it wouldn't have happened. If you weren't
right,
there,
and
it
so
wouldn't have
many of
happened.
those defendants were saying it was actually egged on by them, and of course that
Yeah.
ends up being the entrapment defense. Again, some January 6 defendants have tried to use this defense as well. So in the case of Patriot Front, there haven't been that many arrests yet, and to the extent that they've happened, I don't think there's ever been a felony arrest. They've been arrested for misdemeanors. There hasn't yet been an entrapment defense sort of offered. I think things will really change if they ever get themselves wrapped up in a conspiracy like that. So come watch this video again. If someday they get charged with some kind of massive conspiracy to murder or
Right.
terrorism or racketeering or something like that. Until then, they've been getting arrested for smoke bomb
Small crimes.
conspiracies
Yeah.
and basically putting stickers where you're not allowed to put stickers.
Yeah. Well, what a great conversation with you, Ford. Really appreciate it. And I really appreciate your knowledge of this group and breaking it down for us quite a bit, and all of your great work that you've done over the years, really just showing up to these events and getting all that footage that you do. And really appreciate you a lot, Ford. Thank you so much for being here. Where can people find your work?
So my outlet is called News to Share. That's news, the number to share. I film primary source raw documentary footage, and what I mean by that is that when you watch my YouTube channel, you don't actually see very much of me or my contributors. It's just raw video that shows you sort of exactly what happened on the ground. So rather than hearing the opinions of the camera person and so forth, it is raw footage that then kind of enables people to start the discussion in an informed way.
Love that. Thank you so much, Ford. Thank you for being here.
Yep, you got it. Thank you.